Hello Bruins, this is Mrs. Farouk, and today this screencast is going to go over population changes and how we can quantify those small changes in allele frequency and whether a population changes or not, and how natural selection is the mechanism that causes adaptive evolution. So if you look at this picture, this is a computer-generated picture. It's called the New Face of America, and this is a new face how a multicultural society, blending of many cultures. So variation again is very healthy and important to any population. For example, here is the cheetah. The cheetah populations face a drastic variation reduction. Their population is so small that most of the cheetahs that exist are so alike that they're having trouble uh, in uh, um, reproduction, and we'll discuss that later on. So when we talk about small changes, we're talking about microevolution on a small scale, and this is where we're taking Mendel's idea of inheritance and Darwin's idea of natural selection and change over time, and here we are quantifying the change in a population. And just a reminder, what a population is basically organisms living in the same place at the same time, of the same species, and we regard this as like the unit of evolution. And gene frequency, we're going to talk a lot about. It's the alleles in a population and those changes in the alleles. So for example, if you look at a dominant gene, what's the frequency or percentage versus the recessive allele, and we can quantify and measure the allele in a population and see if it changes over time. Now if you look at a whole population, all the alleles that are represented by each individual is what we call the gene pool. And the DNA is the raw material for evolution, meaning it is what evolution works with. So genetic shuffling, as you remember, is done by meiosis, like crossing over, independent assortment, segregation, and any change, like for example as a mutation that will affect the phenotype, can bring an added variation. Now how an individual reproduces and how successful they are is what we call fitness. So evolution occurs due to genetic variation. If you don't have that variation, there's nothing that an environment can select and nothing can change. So three key sources of variation here is mutation. Mutation is, if mutation occurs, that how it introduces a change in the DNA that can affect the phenotype. A gene flow is the ability for groups of individuals moving in or out that could change the gene pool. And of course sexual reproduction, meiosis and random fertilization. So evolution of population is now quantified by analyzing allele frequency. So for example, you look at the first generation compared to the second, see the number of dominant phenotypes versus recessive phenotypes, and look at over generations, see how it changed. So first of all, in order for the change, as Darwin mentioned, that variation is heritable. The traits are passed on to offspring, and individuals that survive to reproduce, their traits are the ones that are passed on. And of course, gene flow either can increase the allele frequency or decrease, or bring in a new trait. So just as a review, natural selection will determine which trait is the most beneficial that allows that individual to survive to reproduce. And when they reproduce, they're passing their traits, and over time that trait accumulates and a population might change or stay the same. So here, if you look at the quick steps of the process of natural selection, you always need again that variation being inherited, that struggle for existence, the competition. because resources are limited, and those individuals that can survive in that particular environment will survive to reproduce. So now like I said, we can quantify that change, and we say that relative frequency is again the number of times that allele occurs in the gene pool, and we're measuring the number of dominant or recessive. So in this case, for example, if you're looking at mice, we'll look at the allele, the dominant allele, and the recessive allele. Okay, and basically we're counting the frequency of that allele. And sexual reproduction is a major source of variation, but it does not change the relative frequency of the alleles. It's just shuffling those alleles around. So what causes a population to change? Number one is if variation is reduced, and how it could be reduced is something called by genetic drift. Genetic drift is a major random event that causes, especially in a small population, a change in the allele frequency. So here, for example, you see a man stepping on bugs, and it's a random event, and in this case, most of the green bugs died, and now you have very few green bugs and many more brown bugs left. Or you have these birds in the island, and there was a storm, and a few of those birds were swept away to another island. And now, as you can see, the variation has decreased, where these founder birds only represent, say, the red birds. So when the frequency changes as a result of migration of small subgroup, that subgroup represents those alleles, what's called founder effect. So for example, if here you see a whole population, and if this group founded a population, you see you're represented by these red bugs, these yellow bugs, where in this case this founder population does not have any red bugs represented. Now what happens if you do have a drastic reduction in population and variation diminishes? So if you see these pebbles represent variation or in alleles, and due to genetic drift, a group of individuals were separated, and if you notice now you don't have as much genetic variation, and sometimes in a small population harmful alleles are fixed and can affect the survival of those populations. So again, evolution occurs when there's a drastic change in gene frequency over time, and you can quantify that. So mechanism of change, summarizing, there are four mechanisms. Gene flow, individuals either moving out or in. Genetic drift, a random event that produces variation in a population. Natural selection, only some particular traits being chosen by the environment, and those individuals survive to reproduce. Sexual selection, certain traits chosen, where mate selection could be based on whatever characteristics a mate is selected, and a mutation, which could be a bad mutation or even a good mutation. Now, Hardy-Weinberg is an equation that says, what if a population is in equilibrium? In other words, it's not changing. And if it's not changing, then these are the things that must be happening in order for a population to remain in equilibrium. There must be random mating, no sexual selection. Population must be large, no movement in and out, or in other words, no gene flow, no mutations, and no natural selection. So we have this equation, the Hardy-Weinberg equation, that we can quantify this allele frequency. So here, P represents the dominant trait, or the dominant allele, and Q represents the recessive allele. So P is the dominant allele, and Q is the recessive allele. Now, P squared represents homozygotes. So say, for example, 2 dominant. And heterozygotes is represented by 2pq. In other words, big A, small a. And q square represents the number of recessive homozygotes. In other words, A and A. So if a question asks for the frequency of a dominant allele, they're asking for P. If they're asking for the frequency of a recessive allele, they want to know Q. If the question asks for the frequency of homozygous dominant, that is P squared. For heterozygous, that is 2pq. Or the number of individuals with the recessive trait, and that would be Q squared. So whenever you have a problem, it's good to work with Q, figure out Q, and then if you know Q, you can always figure out P by 1 minus P and figure out P. So here shows the frequency of, say, flower color, and here we have red flowers versus white flowers, and when they're heterozygous, they're pink. Alright, so here the P frequency is 0.7, and here you have Q is 0.3. Now let's say next season you have some plants surviving and some not, and now you see a reduction in P. Now you have 0.5 and 0.5 for both P and Q. And say in the next generation you have the loss of the recessive trait, and this one shows 100% red. So here you can quantify that change that is happening in a population. So in class we will practice the Hardy-Weinberg problems and come with questions over these notes.